I don't have a catchy intro for this video. I'm just excited that this camera finally exists. The QHY533M. That's right, M for mono. Ever since the 533 first came out, astrophotographers have been asking and waiting for a mono version of this thing to be produced. Well, I've got one in my hand now. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Aaron and welcome to Alaskan Astro. So yeah, QHY sent me this pre-production model of the 533M and a filter wheel to test, evaluate, and review. I'm not being paid by QHY in any way for this, and I'm free to say whatever I want, but they did send me these for free to use for a while, so take that for what you will. This is just going to be kind of my first impressions of getting to use these under dark skies and what you need to know about this new camera. Hopefully in about 6 months or so, I'll have another follow-up video going into any more stuff that I figure out about it. So let's dive in. So why are people so excited about this new camera and what sets it apart? Well, for the last several years, ZWO's ASI 533 MC Pro has been one of the most popular cameras for beginners, and for good reason. It uses Sony's IMX533 sensor, which is based on their latest gen backside illuminated tech, which has great sensitivity, high quantum efficiency, low read noise, and no sensor glow. Combined with the low price of that camera, it's been a winning combination, but it's always just been one-shot color. People have been hoping for a mono version of that sensor for a long time, and Sony recently released it. QHY has put it in this camera, and it unlocks the full world of LRGB imaging for that great luminance detail, and it unlocks the full potential of narrowband imaging. So let's talk about the specs of what all that means and how it relates to real-world shooting. So obviously the core of this camera is its cooled IMX533 sensor. Uses BSI technology, has a dual readout mode with a huge drop in read noise and jump in dynamic range, 90% peak quantum efficiency, deep full well, no sensor glow, 1 GB RAM buffer for reliable file transfer, and a 14-bit ADC. And perhaps the most striking feature that everyone likes to talk about, it's a small square sensor. The square is definitely where people's personal opinions come into play, so I'll just tell you my take on it. I like the square. It actually has a couple things going for it. For one, it makes rotation and framing of your targets trivial. We like to joke that there's only 2 rotations in AP, 0 and 90. Well, with this camera, you only get 1. And honestly, I found that most things I've shot actually frame up pretty well. Plus, it's already cropped for Instagram for you. The small sensor does have some disadvantages. You're just not going to get a very large field of view, even compared to other cameras like the 294 or 1600. However, the small sensor does carry some advantages. For instance, you can usually get away using the smallest size accessories like 1.25-inch mounted filters and the smallest size filter wheels, which are usually the cheapest common option. It's also really easy on your optics since you're just using the center portion of everything, which is usually the best corrected with the least amount of effort. Another advantage that I didn't even think about until I started working with the files I was getting from this is that small file size. It's just really easy on storage and on processing. As I was working through editing things, my computer was just breezing through them and it hardly takes up any space on my hard drives. Probably something I should have seen coming, but it was a nice surprise. Okay, so let's talk about these specs and the build and compare it to some other common cameras. I thought we could compare the 533 to the venerable ASI 1600 and the newer QHY533M since these are comparable or interesting comparisons. Just a heads up, the 533 that QHY sent me is truly a tester pre-production model, so specs are subject to change. That said, from what I've seen in the product announcements and talking to them, I wouldn't expect anything major to change. The first thing I noticed when I unboxed the 533 was it's really big. It shares the same chassis as the 268, which you can see is noticeably larger than ZWO's small form factor cameras. Now, I asked QHY about why this is, and their answer for me was that these new Sony sensors put off a lot of waste heat and it needs a big heat sink, but I don't really understand that because the ASI 533MC, which has basically the same sensor, is in one of these small form factors and it has no trouble hitting its target temperatures. So my guess is it has more to do with streamlining production so that they can use the same parts on things. Right here, you can immediately see the difference in sensor size between these three monocams. Let me pull up a comparison so you can see how they look on top of each other. For reference, this is the 80mm f6 frac that I've been doing most of my testing on. The 533 is noticeably the smallest, the 1600 is mid-range, and the APS-C sensor on the 268 is obviously larger and wider than either of them. And the prices of these cameras reflect that. The 268 MSRPs for $2,400. The 1600 brand new MSRPs for $1,280. Although I'm not sure I'd recommend that anybody buy a new 1600 at this point with how frequently they come up used. And the QHY533M MSRPs for $1,160. Which, for the latest generation sensor technology in a cooled camera body, I think is actually a pretty fair price. Most people I was talking with, we were guessing this was going to come in between like $1,200 to $1,400, so this is actually a little bit below that. At risk of boring you to tears, let's talk about some of the number spec differences between these three cameras. One of the clearest distinctions between them is the bit depth of their analog to digital converters, the ADC. The 1600 is a 12-bit camera, the 533 is a 14-bit camera, and the 268 is a 16-bit camera. Now, what this means to you as an astrophotographer is how finely the brightness values of your data are split up and saved. More is obviously better. What you're going to see this as is smoother gradients. Stacking can make up for some of that, but it's always best to start with the best data you possibly can. Beyond bit depth, and obviously other than sensor size, pretty much every spec between these cameras is identical. This is just a smaller slice of the same sensor. So with that, let's just get rid of this for the rest of our comparison. Unlike those two cameras, pretty much every remaining spec is different between these two. So I'll just try to give you some highlights that you'll actually see in use. One really nice feature of this sensor is that it has no characteristic glow, which means that darks are completely optional. You can just dither to get rid of any hot pixels. As anyone who has shot with the 1600 or seen completed images from it before knows, if you aim this thing anywhere near a bright star, you just get giant microlensing tic-tac-toe artifacts. The 533 doesn't seem to exhibit any of that, and I didn't expect it to, considering how well the 268 does with that. Additionally, the 533 seems to handle halos on bright stars a lot better than the 1600 does. There's an additional feature of the 533 that the 1600 doesn't have, and that's the dual readout mode. There's a point where the gain is increasing where all of a sudden the read noise just drops off a cliff, and that gives you a big boost in your dynamic range, almost back to where you'd be if you were at zero gain. That was really good. Another feature of the 533 that the 1600 doesn't have is dual circuitry readout, where as the gain is increasing, it hits a point where the read noise just drops off a cliff, giving you a big boost in dynamic range. This lets you shoot with almost no read noise, but still have a pretty decent full well depth. To take the most advantage of that, I've been shooting right at the conversion point at gain 56. One more spec that has real-world advantages is the deeper full well depth on this camera. That's the number of electrons that each pixel can hold before it's totally blown out. Now, where you're going to see that is if you're in light pollution and how quickly your stars blow out, or really bright targets like Orion. The 1600 has a full well depth of only about 20,000, and this has a full well depth of 58,000. It's a really noticeable difference when you're taking long exposures, especially with luminance subs, how long you can shoot before you're blowing out too many stars. Let me show you an example of that here. These two images that I'm cycling back and forth between are identical red subs taken with all the same equipment, pretty similar nights, as close as I could get, with the 1600 versus the 533. And you can see how much more blown out the stars are on the 1600 versus the 533. That just makes it a lot easier when you're going to stretch, that you're not going to lose those star cores, and just makes it easier to make a clean finished image. Then when we stretch the data, just with the auto stretch, you can see how much more we're picking up on these individual subs with the 533 versus the 1600. That's just all of these stats coming together for a real-world improvement in the camera. As I was putting on the finishing touches for this video, I was kindly reminded that there's another camera that exists that's probably worth comparing, and that's the 183 in its QHY and ZWO flavors. So let's pretend that's what I have in my hand here and do a quick comparison of that. Just like with the 1600, almost every spec of the 533 is better, with a few interesting notes. Probably one of the biggest differences between these two is the 183 has notoriously bad sensor glow. It's this very characteristic starburst pattern that sometimes doesn't even fully calibrate out for people. Additionally, you're still looking at a 12-bit versus a 14-bit camera. You've got slightly higher quantum efficiency in this one. What the 183 does have going for it is a lower price, being an older camera, and actually having a higher total pixel count. What's interesting is these two cameras actually have a similar total sensor area, but the 183 has these itty bitty little pixels, so it can pack a lot more in the same space. Whether those small pixels are good for you is kind of dependent. It can work out on some wider rigs, but you can also get oversampled pretty quickly, and it can be hard to build a strong signal with the tiny pixels. Between these two small sensor cameras, I think I would go with the 533 in almost every situation. Even on fast wide lenses, that deep full well is a huge advantage. Looking at the physical build of the camera, we've obviously got the square sensor up front, the quality aluminum build, and your cooling fins and fan. And then on the back side, we've got USB 3, this threaded barrel connection. It's the same size as the rest of your Astro gear, but QHY includes this little locking barrel plug that's nice for security, and then QHY's proprietary 4-pin connection that lets you directly connect to their filter wheels, so you don't need to have an additional USB connection there. Coming back to the front of the camera, you've got this interesting front plate. This is just an M42 male thread that lets you connect directly to the filter wheel. So to adjust the final orientation when you bottom out those threads, instead of just tossing in shims and hoping that it ends up where you want it, you loosen up these 3 screws, and then you've got the freedom of movement of these slots, in addition to these holes if they just end up working for you, and there's 3 additional screw holes that are hidden under here. So you find one of those that ends up working, you get it oriented how you want. There's a little bit of guess and check with that, but then you just lock it down and it's really secure right how you want it. So what's interesting is with those slots, you can adjust where the threads bottom out in relation to the filter wheel or an off-axis guider if you had one. This is nice for getting the balance correct and aesthetics, I guess. Then on the filter wheel side, you've got this M42 female connection, as well as QHY's 6-hole through bolt system that I've talked about in another video. And QHY is shipping the correct spacers and adapters so that you hit 55mm back focus out of the box with M48 threads on the end. While I was testing and comparing these cameras, I made the critical discovery that you can do this. The 533 is spec'd to cool to 35 degrees Celsius below ambient for long exposures, and in my testing I found that it could reliably do that. Whether it was 20 Celsius sitting on my desk or below freezing outside, it could reliably hit the target temperatures that I was telling it to get to. Something you may have noticed about the build of this camera is the little tripod foot on the bottom. It's oriented with the sensor, and it's got a couple little threaded connections on the bottom. It has Q20, M4, and M3 options, and it just makes it easy to connect it directly to something with a standard tripod connection, like the Star Adventurer. The camera and filter wheel are set up so that if you get QHY's optional EF lens adapter, you shouldn't need any additional spacers to get a Canon lens to work. which is how I think a lot of people may end up using this camera. In fact, this is one of the setups that I tested for a night. It's the Astronetics mount for the Rokinon 135mm lens, which I'm actually planning to do a full review of this, so look for that. This smaller sensor with its deep full well actually pairs really well with these wider, fast lenses because you get a fair bit of your field of view back and you can take longer subs without blowing out your whole image. You're also only looking at the center portion of the lens where the aberrations usually aren't as bad. Here's an example image I got of just one night's data on some Polaris IFN. What's it like to actually use this camera? Honestly, it's the same as any other astrophotography camera, and I say that as a good thing. Once I've gotten the drivers installed and the hardware all connected, it just runs in Nina like any camera should, and that's been great, and that's really boring. So what's the experience been like? That's been great as well. We knew this camera was going to be good. The sensor is basically the same kind of thing as the QHY533M, just a smaller slice of it. And watching the subs come in, the individual subs, and seeing how much data is in there and how clean it is has been really neat. The deep full well on this has been excellent as well, not having stars blown out with reasonable length exposures. It really is a great camera, and it's nice to see that it's working as intended. This is the rig I've been doing the vast majority of my testing and evaluating with. It's my Meade 80mm triplet with a 1x flattener, chroma filters, and my Atlas mount, and it's really been performing great. The timing on things has not been great though. It's galaxy season and I'm using a relatively wide refractor. There's also been a lot of clouds, and I'm out of AstroDark for the season. Tonight I'm actually using the 4 hours of dusk that I have to try to shoot some Galaxy HA just to see how that works out. I'm glad I've got clear skies. This is probably the last night that I'm shooting for the season. During the last 2 months or so that I was actually able to shoot in between clouds and the northern lights getting in the way, figuring out some gear issues, these are the finished images that I was able to produce. This is Messier 101. Messier 106 and friends. And Messier 51. This one is actually kind of neat in that all of the data was taken after I lost AstroDark for the summer. So this is all during Astro Dusk or whatever you want to call it. And I'm just amazed at how clean this image was able to turn out despite that. And it's also just an RGB image. There's no luminance data that I bothered to take with this. Oof. Well, the star aligned, so I'm trying one more fun thing with this camera, some white light solar. The sky is clear, there's actually some interesting sunspots, so I'm playing around with it. We'll see what the end product looks like, but so far it's kind of promising. This is fun. So as you can see, I'm kind of just playing around in sharp cap here, and my seeing is horrible, but there's definitely some sunspots there, so I don't know, we'll stack this and see what it looks like when we sharpen it up. It's really neat having the bigger field of view. I did have to Barlow it because the focuser on my Daub wouldn't reach focus with the camera, but that's the scope problem, not a camera problem. So anyway, neat. I want to see how this looks. This solar image ended up turning out a lot better than I thought. I was just using my luminance filter, so this is actually a mono image that I gave some nice false color in Photoshop. But yeah, the detail is great in there. As I was shooting, I was getting around 18 to 20 frames per second before my cheap mini PC would bog down on the hard drive. But I think this is a really neat camera for people who are into solar photography and have actual solar setups, not just my little solar film. I have opinions about this camera. I think it's a little bit quirky, and I kind of like it. I really like the foot that they've included on here. I think because of how useful this camera is with lens work and how the foot is oriented with the sensor, that does genuinely make it a useful little addition that's just built right into the hardware. I understand why they used this different little front piece on here so that you don't have to open up the filter wheel carousel to have to bolt it on from the inside, which makes things easier for beginners who might be a little afraid of taking apart their brand new Astro gear. And it does make it neat that you can orient that filter wheel exactly how you want it. It's weird, but it works. I think it's fine that QHY uses their own cable to connect the filter wheel and the camera. Some people get upset that there's no USB hub on the back like ZWO does, but they only give you 2 USB 2 ports. And as soon as you've got autofocus, filter wheel, and the guide camera, suddenly you need to run an additional USB cable or put a USB hub on top anyway, so I've always found that kind of a moot point. I don't understand why this camera needed to be so physically large. There's a tiny little sensor in here, and it can't be that difficult to get it cooled to where it needs to be. Now, for me, who's putting it on a regular sized telescope on a regular mount, it is fine. I couldn't care less. It works out just great for me. But if you're trying to make an ultra portable rig or put it on a star tracker, there's no way around it. There's a lot of camera here. I think the question a lot of people would like me to answer for them is, should you buy this camera? And I'm not going to tell you whether to buy any product or not. I think I've laid out the case for this camera. If you are comparing it to the 1600 to replace one, or look for a used one as your first beginner camera versus this, I think the question it comes down to is, do you want a lot of a little or a little of a lot? The sensor is slightly smaller than the 1600, but boy, it sure outperforms it in just about every single number spec. I think you'll be really impressed with the data that comes through here. For the price, you're getting a slice of pretty much the best sensor technology you can get in a consumer CMOS camera right now. I really have enjoyed getting to use this camera and be part of an actual tester program, getting to work with QHY's staff to troubleshoot through some things and improve this product for its release. Now, I'm pretty much out of darkness for the summer, but I'm actually planning to ship this thing down to California to run in a friend's backyard, so look for an updated review in a couple months of my experience for running it for a long time. Again, QHY did not pay me in any way for this review, other than sending this camera and filter wheel for me to test and evaluate for 6 months. If at the end of all of this, you've decided for yourself that you'd like to order this camera and you'd like to support the channel, I do, however, have affiliate links down in the description to Agena Astro Products and High Point Scientific, 2 great retailers who I'm happy to stand behind. There it is, the QHY533 Mono. Just remember to wear a coat when you're using your square mono sensor, because apparently even in late April, it's still freezing outside.